Well, we have arrived at our first big challenge to traditional Christian beliefs about the Bible and how it was written. If you were a kid who grew up in church, you might have learned that the first five books of the Bible were written by Moses. You might have heard these books referred to as the books of Moses, or another way you could put it is the Pentateuch, which is a fancy Greek word meaning five, or the Torah, which is what often it is referred to in Judaism. Then you might have gone off to college and took a class on the Bible, and the professor completely challenges your view and says the Torah was not written by Moses, but rather it was written by various authors somewhere between the reign of King Josiah and the return of the exiles from the Bible. So we are talking roughly about 1,000 or so years after the events of the Exodus. So, what does the evidence indicate? Was the Torah written by Moses or not? In this video, we will look at this issue in detail and find out. First, though, I want to kind of give a short summary of the books of Moses. The first book, of course, is Genesis. The main focus of Genesis is about God's relationship with humanity and how he made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants to make them a great nation that would bless the entire world. The next book is Exodus. And the main focus of Exodus is how Abraham's descendants multiplied and ended up in slavery in Egypt, and how God rescues them from slavery and provides for them as they travel back to the land of Canaan. We also find various Israelite laws and instructions on how to build the tabernacle, for instance. Next up is Leviticus, which contains laws about sacrifice and eating kosher and various other laws. Then we have Numbers, which starts out with a census of the nation of Israel, and then the book really starts to highlight how Israel is constantly complaining and being disobedient to God during their travels in the wilderness. Also, various laws are also presented in the book. And then lastly, we have Deuteronomy, which is Moses' last instructions and encouragements to Israel before he passes the baton to his successor Joshua. Um, as such, there is a lot of recap in the book of Deuteronomy about the events that took place in the previous four books. So, with that summary, now we go on to the JEPD theory. So, what is the JEPD theory? Well, it is a name for the theory that the Torah is a compilation of various traditions, authors, and it was written and compiled centuries after the Exodus. My problem is not so much with the idea that more than one person wrote the Torah. Although I personally think Moses wrote the vast majority of the Torah, I think it is also clear that there were one or more scribes and slash editors that also contributed to the Torah. For instance, let's take Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5 through 8, which says, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his grave to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended." End quote. I was reading from the New King James Version, and all the scriptures I will be quoting in this video will be from that translation. I think this passage clearly demonstrates that there are portions of the Torah that are not written by Moses. Clearly, Moses did not write about people mourning his death. This was obviously written about someone after Moses died. My problem with the documentary hypothesis, which is also known as the JEPD theory, is the reason given for multiple authors, and I have even more of a problem with how late they date the writing of the Torah. So, what are the reasons given to accept the JEPD theory? What evidence is in its favor? Well, reason number one is that different names of God are used within the text. For instance, the Hebrew name of God, Elohim, is used in Genesis 1:1. Another name for God, Yahweh, is used in Genesis chapter 2, verse 5. Reason number two, the text often switches between stories and complex legal codes. Reason number three is that the text contains different stories that are very similar to each other. We're going to look now at two different passages that are indeed very similar to each other. The first passage is Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. And notice the similarities when I quote these two passages. Notice the similarities between the two. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarah his wife, Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen, when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, that I may live because of you. So it was, when Abraham came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her, and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you say, She is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. End quote. And now we'll look at the second story, which is found in Genesis chapter 26, verses 1 and 11. There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you, and bless you. And I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, She is my sister. For he was afraid to say, She is my wife, because he thought, Lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window, and saw, and there was Isaac, showing endearment to Rebekah his wife. Then Abimelech called Isaac, and said, Quite obviously she is your wife. So how could you say, She is my sister? Isaac said to him, Because I said, Lest I die on account of her. And Abimelech said, What is this you have done to us? One of the people might have soon lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. End quote. So these are the reasons why a lot of scholars believe the book is a hodgepodge of different traditions that was sort of sloppily compiled by an editor centuries after the traditional date given to the Torah. So here's why I don't think these reasons are good reasons. Number one, different names of God do not logically mean that different people are responsible for the creation of the text. On the different names of God, I think, are for theological emphasis. For example, Elohim conveys power, hence its use in the creation of the world. Yahweh is God's covenant name and conveys relationship, hence why it's used in the specific creation of Adam and Eve. Also, we have Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts that have multiple names used for the same God. There is no reason why a single or main author could not use different names for God. Stories with similarities also don't support the idea that the Torah is a sloppy compilation of varying and differing traditions that come centuries later. For instance, let's say I write a biography about my entire life. And in that biography, there are noted similarities between how I react to certain situations and how my dad reacts to them. Would it then be logical to conclude that I couldn't have written it because of the similarities, but rather it has to be someone writing centuries later and they are compiling different traditions or legends about my life? No, I don't think that is a very logical conclusion. In fact, we often see in ancient literature a tendency to highlight stories that contain similarities, So stories that contain similarities are not exactly unusual in the ancient world, but rather is a mark of a literary masterpiece rather than a sloppy compilation of competing legends. I think, though, the nail in the coffin for the JEPD theory is the evidence that supports a date of writing in the late Bronze Age, which happens to be the time period where the Exodus occurred. First piece of evidence is Genesis 37, verse 28. Um, and that says, then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. End quote. How is this evidence? Well, according to James Hoffmeyer in his book, The Archaeology of the Bible, it says, when Joseph was sold to the traders, the cost is specified as 20 shekels of silver. The shekel was a weight, not a coin, in the second millennium BC. 20 shekels would have been around 9 ounces, 260 grams. As it turns out, this is the average price of a slave during the first half of the second millennium BC. In the second half of the millennium, the cost went up to 30 shekels, and in the early first millennium, it shot up to 50 shekels, end quote. Joseph lived somewhere between 1800 to 1600 BC, and thus the Bible accurately records the price of a slave during that time frame. It is extremely unlikely for the Torah to have gotten this price correct if the account is being written, say, around 600 BC, when the price of a slave would have been 50 plus shekels. Another piece of evidence is that there are striking similarities between Deuteronomy and the Hittite-styled peace treaties. The idea seems to be that Deuteronomy represented a formal contract agreement between God and Israel. This Hittite treaty style fell into disuse during the Bronze Age collapse between the years of 1200 to 1500 BC. 1200, basically around 1200 BC, meaning Deuteronomy was most likely written prior to 1200 BC. Remember, the Exodus occurred somewhere between 1400 to 1200 BC. The last reason is that the Torah has the most Egyptian loanwords in any books in the Bible. This shows that the Torah was written when Egyptian influence was strong. Egypt, incidentally, hit its peak in power and greatness under Pharaoh Seti I and Pharaoh Ramses II, aka Ramses the Great, who is a possible contender for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Ramses the Great reigned from 1279 to 1213 BC. Books like Ezra and Nehemiah, which the JEPD theorizes could be written around the same time, does not show Egyptian influence, but rather Persian influence on the Hebrew language during the 400s, which makes total sense given that the Persians were the superpower during the writing of Ezra and Nehemiah. The fact that the Torah has the most Egyptian loanwords also fits well with the idea that the Israelites were just fresh out of Egypt, and it makes sense that there would be an Egyptian influence on Hebrew during that time. All of this does not prove Moses wrote most of the Torah, but it does show that the Torah was written during the lifetime of Moses. So the question has to be asked, why do a lot of secular scholars embrace the JEPD theory? A lot of secular scholars and academics do their work through the lens of naturalism. Naturalism is basically the philosophical position that nature is all that there is and all that ever will be. It is a rejection of the possibility of miracles and the supernatural. Thus, the stories of the Torah need a completely natural explanation that excludes the possibility of such things like the Nile turning to blood or the Red Sea parting being actual historical events. The only naturalistic theory out there to account for these stories is that they are Israelite myths and legends that developed over time in Israelite society and became widely circulated and accepted as historical reality over the centuries, and then eventually written down sometime between the king of Josiah and the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. If, however, the Torah is written during the time period of the Exodus, then such things as the historicity of Moses and the Exodus are far more likely than just being a product of slow legendary development over the centuries in Israel. So we're going to see this tendency by secular scholars to try to date biblical books later than they really are to avoid the idea of the supernatural, We particularly will see this when we get to our overview of the Old Testament prophetic books and the Gospels. Both in the Old Testament prophetic books and the Gospels, there are prophecies that these books make that have come to pass in history, and a secular scholar has to date the books after said prophetic events come to pass, in order to avoid the supernatural concept of predictive prophecy, even though the textual evidence points to it being written prior to the fulfillment of the prophecy. Well, that does it for this topic. Next up, I plan on doing a video on whether the Bible is myth or history, as we continue along in our series of how the Bible was made. If you like this content, please hit that like and subscribe button.